In this lesson, I want to introduce you to 3D layers. Did you know After Effects could do 3D? The way it works is very simple, and it's not a full-blown 3D where you can get amazing things like if you actually use a 3D application like Autodesk Maya or 3D Studio Max or Cinema 4D. Um, it does, though, however, allow you to do some basic things, and it will it's easier once you learn about the camera and you can come up with cool effects and animation effects and camera effects using 3D layers and 3D objects. So we're going to do the introduction of it and just a real quick tutorial in terms of what the 3D layer does and how it works. So I have a composition set up here called 3D example 3D layer example, and it's just basically 1920 by 1080, 24 frames per second, and 1 second duration with a black background color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import basically these 6 images which represent sides of a dice. So this is the one with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what we're going to do in After Effects is using 3D layers is we're going to put these images together to create a simple cube. And again, as I mentioned, this is just one way you can use it to create really primitive 3D shapes, and you can also use it for motion graphics stuff as well, as you will see towards the end of the tutorial. So we're going to first import those images. So I'm going to go File, or I'm going to right mouse button under Project, Import Files, and we'll navigate to the place where the texture files are. And I can shift select or control select, I should say, control select or command select them to select just the dice images. And you want to import it as footage. Just make sure that the sequence option is not checked on. If you have the sequence option, it will think that this is frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, 4, 5, 6, and it will try to play it like a video clip with these dice images showing instead of actual images themselves. So you just want to make sure TIFF sequence is not on and footage is selected. So we import those images, there they are, and I'm just going to drag them and drop them onto my 3D layer example timeline. These are my layers, and what I want to do is basically first what I want to do is just select all of them and just make sure the scale is a little bit smaller because I did make these high resolution, but we just want to make sure that it's smaller. So I'm going to set the scale to 60% for all of them by selecting all the layers. And after that, I need the first one. I don't really need to look at the other ones. So we're going to do this one at a time. So to turn on your 3D layer, how do you do that? Or to make a layer 3D? See this cube right here on your columns? We have the blur, we have apply mask effects or mask effects, and we have 3D. And what I want you to look at is if you look at your transformation options here, anchor point, you have two numbers, two columns of numbers. The first one represents X axis, the second one represents Y axis. Position, same thing, X, Y. Scale, the X side and the Y side. Rotation, because we're going in a circle, there's no XY. And of course, opacity doesn't have XY either. But things that are relating to your screen, you have an X position, that's the horizontal, and the Y position, that's the vertical, or the Y axis. When I select the cube, when I click on that box for under the cube, what that will do is basically turn my layer into a 3D object. Now it's 3D, see? And all of a sudden you have 3 columns because now it's representing the X, Y, and Z. So X, this is your geometry and math coming back. X is to go horizontally or the X axis. Y is for vertical or the Y axis. And Z is towards you or away from you. So this is coming towards us, and this is going away from us. By default, Z is set to 0 because that's where the plane of view is. And we'll get into that when we look at the camera example. or setting up cameras in After Effects. But for now, what we want to do is just kind of look at this as a 3D object. Within your 3D object, once you turn it into a 3D object and you select position, scale, or one of these with your arrow tool, you have a triangle, which basically means that's where you're going to move the objects. You have also a rectangle, and that will allow you to resize the object. And you have a circle, which will allow you to rotate the object. And you have them on each different axis. Now, it gets a little confusing by watching it in the active camera. So for 3D stuff, what I really recommend you doing is going to, in your composition window, all the way to this corner, there's a view option. You want to go to 4 view, and what that will do is show, and yeah, I want to change this to fit up to 100% for all of them. And notice that whichever quadrant I click, that's where these triangles are, which means that that's the window that's selected. So I want to just change this to fit for all of these windows so that we can see them very well. And here what we see is basically the active camera. One of your quadrants should be the active camera, which basically is what we will see, what we see as we are in our 1 view. But now that since we're in 4 views, we also will see the front, which will basically show you the front of the object, the left or right side, and you can change this. I'll show you in a second. And the top side, how it looks from the top. So right now we see the whole image, but in terms of the 3D world, all this is like a flat piece of paper. And we can rotate it. As we rotate it, you can notice that it's changing in the other screens. This is the one that is like your viewfinder that is actually showing you how it's actually going to change or how it will look on the camera. And I'm going to turn this back to 0. And if I move it, it'll move in my other cameras as well, depending on where it is. So this is a little bit tricky, and it's okay if you don't get it at the first chance or first example or the first time you try it. But basically what we're going to do here is take these things and build a square dice. So we're going to turn the 3D options on for all the other layers. And what I want to do with this one showing, I want to just move this over. And the best way to do this really, if you want to do this in After Effects, is to really use your numbers here. So I'm going to move this over a little bit. And I'm going to turn on dice side number 2. And I'm going to bring up my position options as well. And for number 2, under position, I want to move it back. So I'm using my active view, my top view. I can see that this one right here is here, and you can use your triangles, and as you go up to it, your options here, and do it this way. As you go up to it, it will tell you which axis it's trying to move in. Um, but the reason I kind of just use the numbers is because I can be aware and sure of these things as we work with it. And again, it's not like 100% required, but there's all different ways to do this. But I'm just trying to show you the easiest way, I would say. So now I'm in 1 view, and I switched to my front camera. And the reason I did that is because I want these two to basically be stacked up right against each other. So that way I can zoom in and just kind of move this so that they're pretty much stacked onto each other and snapping. If you have snap on under view, snap to guides, it will want to snap to each other as well. So that's the first side and the second side. Of course, you can't see the second side because it is hidden. Now, if I turn it off, I can see it. But if I go to 4 view now and change that to my active camera again, basically what I'm seeing is this with the two stacked up against each other. Now what I want to do is take my other dice. I'm going to turn that layer on, side 3, and bring up my controls. And using my numbers here, I'm going to push that further back. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm going to push that further back. So we're going to go on the X side, and I'm just going to rotate it. I'm going to use orientation. We want to rotate it 90 degrees on the Y axis here so that it faces the other way. And I'm just going to basically use this to kind of connect my pieces together, if you will. Now this is going to be an issue because you can't see it. They look like this and they look like this. So what we could see, and they look like this. So what we could do is use our left camera in this case to just simply try to match that up. You can see that if this line right here represents one of the other sides. So what I want to do is just very carefully, as best as you can, just get it as close to this as possible. So right there, and you can zoom in, or you can just go 4 view and switch to 1 view. Um, but I will stay in 4 view, and basically that lines up. Because if it doesn't line up, what you'll see is something like this, where you can see the line going through your artwork. So it's very important to have layer controls on so you can see these things. And I'm going to align it as best as I can. Now, what this is telling me, because I have this line here, whatever layer that is, I think that's layer 1, the first side. I need to move that out of the way, or not out of the way, but to align it properly. And I think that is the z-axis, so it's got to go this way on the z-axis. So we're going to control the Z number here. And again, if you want to, you need to zoom in. And we just want it to get as close as possible. And sometimes you'll realize that you really need to use this to give it a little bit more precise, or you may need to punch in numbers and try like 42.5 or something like that. But either way, we kind of sort of have our square thing going, except this is, see how it's got a gap here, so we want to close that gap in. So you can select it from here, from the top layer. I'm just going to select this layer from the top view area, and I'm just going to bring that in closer so that there is just very minimal gap. You can see it here as well, that there is a slight gap, but it'll be okay. Again, as I mentioned, this is not necessarily like production, 3D software package type stuff, but there's some cool things you can do with this. So that's my third layer, and then I'm going to go to my fourth layer. Basically, if you haven't figured this out by now, it's repetitive, just kind of putting your images in place, and this works with images that are cubic or square or very simple geometry. And if you are really interested in 3D, this is a great gateway into understanding how the controls work, how 3D space works. So I'm just going to keep adjusting that. Other side. And you'll note from the top camera, you see the square happening, which is the 4 sides. Now we need to go to those last 2 sides. I also highly encourage you to work one at a time on these layers as you put them together. Otherwise, you will get super confused. That 5th side, what we want to do is really, instead of rotating it 90 degrees on the y-axis, like that, what we want to do is rotate it so it's laying down flat on the z-axis. So 90 degrees on the z-axis, and that should show it laying down flat. It's actually the wrong axis. I should have done it in the y-axis. So again, you may need to experiment, but I think this is actually, You may need to experiment a little bit, or sometimes the easiest way to figure this out is to just start changing the axis value. We need 90 degrees on the x-axis. So just start changing the axis value and see which way it starts to rotate. And now what we're going to do is just basically put this. I'm going to click on this and drag it. If you click on the whole entire object and drag it, it'll move the whole thing. Or if you click on, see how that XZ or X shows up, that means that it's specific to that axis that it is going to move in. But in this case, we just want to line this up, the actual image, just very carefully, as best as we can, and then we can use our axes things to do some fine-tune adjustments. Now you'll notice if we're looking at it from the left or from the front view, basically the two different sides, it's right in the middle of the cube. We actually want it on the bottom or the top. Let's do the bottom first. So we want to drag this left or front view. I'm going to drag this so that it is the bottom. And again, you may need to zoom in depending on how big your monitors are. And we want to just adjust it and put it right there. So that's the bottom face. You can still see it from the top side because we're looking from the top down on this top angle. And I'm going to do the same thing for the last dice. We have to change it to 90 degrees this way. And we want to move it right on top here on our top view and just fine tune it. Also a good idea to lock your other layers once you get it in place. That way you are not accidentally moving anything. Especially this last layer, which is going to be on top of the other objects. So once you adjust it and it sits on top, remember it's going to be right in the middle looking at the front camera. So we need to put it on the top here. And we can adjust it, fine-tune adjustments here. All right, now it's a cube. You can't see it because it started off as a square image, but it's a cube. And what I'm going to do, the final thing I'm going to do, is basically assign all the other layers to be child of that first dice layer. That way I'm just controlling the position, rotation of this first one, and it'll rotate and change everything else for the other ones. So if you have managed to keep up with me so far and have figured this out, what I'm doing is basically now adjusting this to change my dice. And I'm going to use the orientation instead of the rotation for this. I'll bring up scale too. So we can adjust the position, orientation, that's my cube or my dice. And you can set your scale, you can set your keyframes so that you can animate something interesting of or include an animation of something interesting using 3D space, etc. If you want to, by the way, not use these for your animation and just use the handles, if you click over the circle, you can actually adjust it visually on screen. And again, the X, the higher the number, the further away from the camera and from the viewer it is. The lower the number, the closer it is to the camera or the viewer. So if you go into negative territory, you will actually, the dice will get bigger. Also, once you parent the other ones, you can probably lock it, or you won't, or you'll accidentally grab it by mistake, and you can just focus on animating the parent. So this is a very quick and easy way to do animations in 3D. They're, as I mentioned, they're not quite 3D in terms of a lot of the other things that's happening, but it's just a very easy way to control objects and layers. And I'm going to go back to the text option because what if I want to do a flyby effect? So instead of this going like that, I'm going to get rid of this effect. So I'm going to go to effect and delete that whole thing. So it just stays and I'm going to get rid of the position too because I don't want the position to move. All I'm going to do in this case is, so I'm going to select all of these. What I want to do here in this case is after it comes in, I'm going to get rid of the text animator. So basically I'm getting rid of all the effects. And at this point, I'm going to turn this into a 3D layer. And what I could actually do now is kind of, we call it a flyby, basically where it looks like the things are flying by. Basically what I'm going to do is put a position keyframe and about a few frames later, we'll say less than a second, but more than half a second. If I just increase that or decrease, I should say rather, that Z value, what's happening is flying right past the camera. And that's a cool effect, kind of like if you think about Star Wars, where that effect was used. And as you do this, you may have to adjust the thing a little bit, but basically this is now a 3D object because we have it as a 3D object. And instead of us animating it that way, it literally flies right by the camera. And we call that a fly through in the motion graphics world, or when you're making graphics and things like that. And if you like it so much that you may be like, oh, maybe I wanted to, do it for all of them. So you can basically, I'm going to leave the scale. You have to leave the scale the same. I'm going to make sure my rotation is back to 0. My opacity is 100%. And again, instead of controlling the scale here, so at 100% or whatever, whatever is big enough for your taste in terms of how you want it to stay on screen. Instead of that, what I'm going to do, so instead of like adjusting the scale and everything and keyframing that, here, so we had all those keyframes. So instead of doing all those keyframes with the 3D button, what it will allow you to do is just simply for position, we just can push it all the way back into space. Way into space. And we can have that come up this way. Or if you see, again, um, Star Wars titles, it actually flies right beyond the camera. So like that. And this is too fast, so I'm going to actually take my keyframe and expand it, make it go slower, and adjust my work area so I only see that part. And let's say that I don't want it to go the same way. I want it to maybe hang out a little bit longer and start going away, like in Star Wars. So I'll go something like 600. Actually, I'm going to punch in for the Z value on my position, something like 6,000. 6,000, you can still see it. So I'm going to go incredibly ridiculous, 12,000. And now it's like way out there in space, way away from the camera. But of course, this is going to move very fast too. And you'll see what I mean by that because it's re-rendered. It goes by so fast that it looks like a fade basically. So maybe 12,000 is a lot. I'll just go back to 6,000. And putting in my ease out. And here what I'm going to do is just introduce the opacity because I do need it to fade out. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and add an opacity thing at 100%. And then at the end, it'll be 0%. So basically, that's how it will fade out at the end. And you can also do interesting things with text layers as well, since it's in 3D. You can change, you can twist around and reveal itself like that. You can do XY rotation like that or like that as well. So this is a really, interesting tool and how you can use 3D layers to just kind of enhance and do less with your layers. Or do less keyframing, but have more effective ways of creating animation with your layers.